Hello and welcome to the Storytelling for the Soul podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Kanata, and this is the place we talk about all things expressive writing and other creative techniques, all with a little bit of Buffy the Vampire Slayer thrown in. Buckle up and enjoy. Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Storytelling for the Soul podcast. I am your host, Sarah Kanata. Thank you for joining me for another episode. Today I want to talk all about boundaries. And where I want to start is asking you a question. Do you have boundaries? Personally, as I've matured and gotten older and lived through more life experiences, I've come to the realization that having boundaries is one thing and it's very important. And if you're struggling to answer whether you have boundaries, it probably means that you don't. And I strongly suggest that you carve some time out of your day to genuinely think about 2 to 3 non-negotiables if you don't like the word boundaries. So having boundaries is one thing. I know that personally, I'm not too bad at actually self-reflecting and having awareness about my boundaries. And then there's enforcing them, which is a completely different thing and is often much harder. So I've come to do a lot of thinking about boundaries in the context of this idea that growth happens outside of our comfort zone. And I genuinely think that that is true. When we're comfortable, what it typically means is that even if something was perhaps a little bit uncomfortable to begin with, we've now grown to a point where we no longer feel like our capacity is being pushed or stretched in any means. So I'm all for pushing our boundaries to a certain extent. And what I mean by that, I'm referring to pushing our comfort zone from a place of safety. So back to what I've talked about in earlier episodes in embodied processing language. So just to recap for those of you who may not have listened to the earlier episodes, I am an embodied processing practitioner. So embodied processing is a body-based approach to working with trauma. And in embodied processing, we often talk about having a resource. Now, a resource is a sense of safety, support, comfort. Language can be a barrier at times, so if you're not relating to any of those words, just think of the opposite of overwhelm. But the idea of a resource is once we have a resource and we practice and ground ourselves in that resource, pushing our boundaries and the envelope becomes a little bit easier. Because when we are triggered and we find ourselves getting to a place where things are just too overwhelming and our nervous system is just completely in an overwhelmed state, we come back to our resource and we come back to that sense of safety, comfort and support, or the opposite of overwhelm. So I'm all for pushing our comfort zone and boundaries to a certain extent. Where I have a problem with the notion of pushing our boundaries, and it's actually quite popular in the personal development realm, this idea that nothing grows inside our comfort zones. And I'm all on board with that. However, I do think that sometimes this gets a little out of hand. And where I don't think the notion of pushing our comfort zone works is when doing so basically means we're being someone who we really aren't. And I want to give you an example of this from my own lived experience from many moons ago now. Just for context, I'm recording this in July 2024. I'm 3 days away from turning 37. However, in my early 20s, I landed my first, I'm doing quotation marks here, which of course you can't see because this is an audio podcast, but I want to say I landed my first proper job in communications. And really, that was a wonderful thing that happened to me because it really opened my eyes. And up to that point, I was very much a homebody. I was never very popular in high school. I had my own little clique of friends. But really, I was a homebody and I didn't really have much life experience or exposure. And that first job, once I got over the part where I was shy and everyone thought that I was just the girl in the corner who didn't talk, I started making friends, and somehow, and I quite enjoyed this, I became quite popular in the office, if I do say so myself. And with that came the desire to fit in. Now, I am someone who is sitting here, I'm recording this at 7:43, and I'm sitting here in a hoodie, in track pants. And that's who I am. That's who I've always been. I'm not really, I don't like this stereotype. However, I'm going to use it because I think that it will help you to connect with what I'm trying to say. I'm not really, and again, I'm using air quotes, a girly girl. I'm not the kind of person who gets all looked forward to glamming up on the weekend and putting on my heels and dressing up. I don't like that kind of thing. Never have. And I think it's safe to say at 37, I never will. However, I went through this period in my 20s where I thought, you know what? How about we try this on? And in this particular workplace, pretty much, I want to say, looks was a lot. Looks and perception meant a lot. And I have this firm vision of the past of basically me wearing heels for the first time, which, let me assure you, was not glamorous one bit. Nor was I graceful walking in heels because I spend 90% of my life in runners. However, I gave it a go and I will commend myself for that much, at the very least. Walking in heels, going to a business meeting, and in my mind, there was a perception of who I had to be in this particular workplace to progress my career. So I started in a very junior role. I wouldn't say very quickly. I think some things happened, didn't exactly go to my timeline or my plan of the timeline, but eventually I did work my way up to a more senior role. But I had this distinct understanding and feeling that in order to do that, I essentially had to be someone who I wasn't. And I don't look back on this time with any negativity whatsoever because I figure, well, it gave me the opportunity to try this persona on. And at the conclusion, when I left that workplace, I had a lot better understanding of who I am and who I want to be and who I want to surround myself with. However, I have this very distinct memory of wearing heels for the first time to a business meeting, getting out of the car, and one of the wedge in the heels got lodged in the grass and my foot plunged forward without the heel. So that kind of just tells you I'm not exactly the most graceful of women. I'm kind of clumsy, which is just part of who I am. But if I look back on that, I would say that in that moment, I was pushing my comfort zone. And as a 37-year-old with a lot more life experience under my belt, I can safely say I just have no appetite for that kind of thing anymore. And I've come to this place where I have, I would say, 2 or 3 really solid non-negotiables in my life. I'll give you one of them just as an example. It's very simple. It revolves around peace. I feel as though at this point in my life, I've worked really hard to get to a point where I can be in a certain environment where I feel safe and I feel at peace for most of my time. So anything that enters my world that disrupts that peace is a really big problem for me. And I moved into my new apartment where I'm living alone for the first time in December 2023. And I had my first little taste of something that just spun my world out a little bit recently. And it just reiterated to me how much peace is important to me and how much I value my peace, because I don't like drama. I've never been the kind of person who likes drama, gossip. I'm very straightforward. I'm very transparent. I'm direct. Some may say too direct and it comes off as a little bit cold, but it's who I am. And I would much rather people be direct with me in turn. I don't want someone, this is just a random example, I don't want someone to lead me to believe that we're the best of friends when in actual fact, they're talking about me behind my back, or they don't genuinely like who I am. That's not the kind of relationship that I'm interested in. So where I'm going with this is I'm all for pushing comfort zones, but not when it impinges on our boundaries. And I have a few things that are coming to mind right now that would inevitably, very likely, propel my career forward. But I've gotten to a place with these particular things where the cost just isn't quite worth it for me. And it all comes back to this peace. This disruption of peace, which is one of my non-negotiables. So I don't want to ramble on for too much longer in this episode, but I am hoping to spark a little bit of self-reflection on your end for you to think about what your boundaries are or what are your non-negotiables in life. You can have as many as you want. For me, 2 or 3 work really well. And if you're struggling with this, think about the things where you weigh up pros and cons and the cost of those things, even though there's very likely a tangible benefit, a very clear benefit, you conclude they're just not quite worth your while. I'm going to leave it there. If you'd like to learn more about me and my work with expressive writing, mindfulness, and other creative techniques, you can check out my website, sarahkanata.com. Don't worry about the spelling. I'll pop that in the show notes. You are always very, very welcome to reach out to me directly via email, info@sarahkanata.com. I'm also on all of the main social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. You'll either find me under my name, Sarah Kanata, or Storytelling for the Soul. Thank you, and I will talk to you in the next episode.